Imagine the dust of an old road sticking to the feet of a man who knows he could die at any moment, and yet he keeps walking. He has no sword, no gold, no protection, just words and faith. A faith so absurd it drives him to face empires, furious crowds, and crosses raised on the horizon. Have you ever stopped to think about what makes someone die for something that cannot be seen? What turns ordinary men into spiritual legends, into invisible pillars of a faith that spans millennia? That's where the story begins, but not in the way you might imagine. They weren't born in palaces. They weren't educated by scribes. None of them had inheritance, prestige, or fame. They were men of cracked earth, with hands calloused by the weight of nets and sweat. Some fished, others collected taxes. There were those who dreamed of revolution, blood, national glory, ordinary men, bearded, sometimes rough, men the world would hardly notice. But something happened, something that couldn't be contained in words, but set their souls ablaze. Jesus looked at them, and they knew. They didn't know exactly what, but they knew they had to follow him. It was a call that didn't come from the mind, it came from the center of the chest. There was no map, no guarantee. Just an invisible promise stitched into the skin of a carpenter who spoke like no one ever had. And so they dropped everything, families, routines, stability, the kind of thing that to the world's eyes no one in their right mind would abandon. But they did, and they walked with him. At first, it felt like they were at the center of something grand, though undefined. Crowds gathered. Miracles happened. The impossible suddenly became routine. Men walked on water. Bread multiplied. Lepers regained their skin. The blind saw. The dead rose. It was like living in a parallel world where the sacred touched the ground and eternity fit within a man's gaze. But then came the betrayal. It wasn't an external enemy, not a Roman, not a Pharisee. It was one of the 12, a friend, someone who shared the bread, the secrets, the quiet of nighttime journeys. It was there, in the darkness of the garden, that their faith was ripped from the stage and thrown into the basement. Jesus was arrested, condemned, crucified, and they fled, ran, denied, trembled. Fear took the place of faith. Silence replaced the songs. The cross silenced what once was hope. But that wasn't the end of the story. It was the breaking point. Because 3 days later, the tomb was empty, and the one who seemed defeated returned breathing glory. They saw. They ate with him. They touched the scars. It wasn't delirium. It wasn't legend. It was real. And that's when everything changed again. Do you understand what that meant? Men who had faltered before soldiers were now willing to face crowds armed with stones. They weren't just defending an idea anymore. They were proclaiming a certainty. Because only someone who saw death defeated with their own eyes can look at the world and say, "Go ahead and kill me. I know this isn't the end." Peter was the first to rise. The very one who had denied Jesus 3 times in the darkest night of faith. But forgiveness rebuilt him, and the fear melted away. In Rome he preached as if there were no tomorrow, and indeed there wasn't. Persecution was growing. Under Emperor Nero, Christians became scapegoats, blamed for the burning of Rome, hunted like rats. Peter was arrested, and when he received his death sentence, he made an unusual request: to be crucified upside down. He didn't feel worthy to die like his Lord. And there, hanging head down, he left the world one of the greatest declarations of humility and faith ever witnessed. His brother Andrew didn't stay silent either. He traveled to Greece, crossing pagan lands with a courage that didn't come from blood, but from the Spirit. He too was condemned. He too was crucified, but not on an ordinary cross. His was shaped like an X, and even bound to it, he kept speaking for 2 days, preaching, comforting, proclaiming, until his voice fell silent but not before echoing in the souls of all who heard him, and perhaps it still echoes even today, where true faith exists. James, son of Zebedee, was called a son of thunder, impetuous, intense, steadfast. He was one of the first to climb the mountain and see Jesus transfigured in light. He was also one of the first to fall. Herod wanted to please the religious leaders and ordered his execution, just like that. But they say James's own accuser, moved by his resolve, chose to die alongside him. Imagine that, the informer kneeling with the condemned, both giving their lives together, not as adversaries, but as newborn brothers in a faith that can't be explained, only felt. And John, the youngest, the closest, the one who rested his head on Jesus's chest, the only one who stayed at the foot of the cross when everyone else fled. To him, Jesus entrusted his mother. And with her, perhaps, the tenderness of faith. After the resurrection, John carried on. He preached, he wrote, he founded churches until he was arrested. They tried to kill him. They threw him into boiling oil, but he survived, miraculously. So they exiled him to Patmos. And it was there, on that deserted island, surrounded by rocks and silence, that he saw the heavens open. The apocalypse was born from the isolation of an apostle who had seen it all, and still hoped for more. You know what's strangest about all this? None of them backed down. None tried to erase what they'd lived. None regretted it. All were persecuted. All suffered. Nearly all died brutally. And yet, none denied. None renounced. There was no earthly reward, no fame, no stability. There was pain. There was a cross, and there was faith. Real faith. Faith that bleeds, faith that burns, faith that endures when the whole world turns its back. The question that lingers is, why? What makes a man die for something that brings no glory? What makes someone embrace their own death with eyes full of peace? Maybe it's because they knew. They didn't just think. They didn't just imagine. They knew. Because they had seen, they had touched, they had walked with him. They had heard the voice. They had felt the presence. And when someone sees, when someone truly encounters, you can't pretend nothing happened. You can't go back. Their faith didn't come from religion. It came from an encounter, and that changes everything, because someone who only hears can doubt. Someone who only repeats can get confused. But someone who saw, who was there, who felt the heavens touch the earth in the midst of the ordinary, that person doesn't turn back. They were ordinary men. But something extraordinary pierced through them, and that piercing came at a high cost. But it was real, and because of that, they couldn't stay silent. They walked with a conviction that seemed absurd. They crossed borders, deserts, and foreign cities, carrying a simple yet profoundly dangerous message. The kingdom of God had come. That alone was enough to enrage emperors, priests, and philosophers. The world, which until then bowed to Caesar, was now confronted with a new authority, one that wore not a crown of gold, but of thorns. What they said was almost insane, that a carpenter from Galilee had defeated death and now reigned over all, that stone gods had no more power, that the temple, once sacred, had been surpassed by something living. How could that not spark fury? And it did. Philip was one of the first to feel the weight of that clash. His path took him to Phrygia, where echoes of the old faith still rang from pagan altars. He preached in the squares. He spoke of a God who didn't dwell in idols, but in the broken heart. He converted Romans. He converted Greeks. But he also angered priests, governors, and merchants, because the faith he brought threatened the established systems. Accused of blasphemy, he was arrested, tied to an X-shaped cross, like Andrew. And there, even hanging, even bleeding, he kept speaking. He didn't curse. He didn't call down plagues. He asked that his executioners know the love that had transformed him. And only after 2 days of pain did his voice fall silent. But its sound still resonates. Those who listen closely can feel it. And then comes Bartholomew. You might not know this name well. He doesn't appear as often as Peter or John, There aren't as many verses about him, but silence carries power too. Bartholomew took the gospel to distant lands, India, Mesopotamia, Armenia, and there in Armenia he converted kings. He changed destinies. But every heart won to the gospel was a crown torn from pagan priests, and they wouldn't allow it. Bartholomew was captured, and what they did to him, it crosses the threshold of the bearable. He was flayed alive, his skin stripped away, centimeter by centimeter, and then beheaded. Yes, all that happened to a man who only wanted to proclaim hope, love, truth. And what's most striking, he didn't flinch. He didn't try to bargain. He didn't beg for relief. He just endured, because he knew. And those who know stand firm. Thomas, too, has one of those stories that disarms the skeptic. He was the doubter of the group. The skeptic, the one who wanted to see with his own eyes, touch, feel. When they told him Jesus had risen, he didn't believe it. "I'll only believe if I touch the wounds," he said. But when he did, everything in him collapsed. The skeptic fell to his knees, and from that moment on, he never doubted again. Thomas went the farthest of all. He reached India, crossed seas, faced strange tongues. And there, in the south of that continent, he founded churches, transformed lives. But his spiritual success drew earthly enemies. One day, while praying in a cave, he was attacked by assassins. A spear pierced his body, and even then, he kept praying until his last breath. What does that tell us? That even the skeptic, when touched by the truth, can become the most fervent of believers. Matthew, the tax collector, might have been the unlikeliest of the apostles. Before meeting Jesus, he was seen as a traitor, someone who exploited his own people for Rome. But it was he who heard the call and left everything, money, status, security, to follow that man. And it was Matthew who wrote one of the most read Gospels in history. He recorded in detail the life, the teachings, the miracles, as if to say, "I saw, I heard, and you need to know." His path took him to Ethiopia. There he converted kings, nobles, servants, but he also struck a nerve with the local religion. During a service, he was killed with a sword at the altar while preaching. Imagine that. A man speaking of forgiveness pierced by blades, blood mingled with bread, a body given up like Christ's own, and even in death his voice kept echoing, because true words don't die, they take root. James, son of Alphaeus, was the least known, sometimes called James the Less, but his importance isn't in how often he appears in the Gospels. It's in the quiet impact he made. He led the church in Jerusalem. He was the pillar in times of doubt, the guide when everything seemed to crumble. But silence bothers the powerful too. One day, he was taken to the top of the temple. The religious leaders demanded he deny Jesus' resurrection before the people. Instead, he shouted, "Jesus is alive!" So they pushed him off. He fell, didn't die, began praying for his attackers, and was killed right there with blows from a club. That scene, a man fallen, praying for those who struck him, is a perfect portrait of what Christian faith is in its rawest form. Love that persists even when everything around it bleeds. And then comes Jude, not Iscariot, the other one, also called Thaddeus, an apostle who brought hope to Persia alongside Simon the Zealot. Together, they converted crowds, but they also sparked panic among the local religious leaders. Accused of subverting order, dishonoring the gods, arrested, tortured. Jude was beaten to death with clubs. Simon possibly sawed in half. Does it sound excessive? Too heavy? It is, because it's real. These men didn't tell pretty stories. They lived barefoot on burning coals, and even so, they smiled, they sang, they proclaimed. Because they had seen, because they knew, and the contrast between all this and what we live today, it's brutal. Today, many have the freedom to believe, but they don't. They have Bibles, but don't read them. They have open churches, but don't enter. Those men, on the other hand, had everything against them, and still they stood firm. Why? Because their faith wasn't an idea. It was a conviction, an experience, an encounter. And that's the question that won't stay quiet. What would you do if you had seen what they saw?